Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Donald, and Steve asked me to tell you my story. And I know a lot of people think that homeless people just kind of show up at a shelter one day, but our stories are a lot more complicated than that. So I always tell my story from the beginning. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I grew up in a house that was doubled up, and that means that the house was for one family, but there was more than one family that lived there, and so we had a house with 3 rooms, and so one room me and my siblings shared. I had 5 brothers and sisters. There was a room for my mother, but that and father, but that also doubled as the living room. And then there was a kitchen, and that was our house, and it was really small, but it was really happy in the beginning. So we did all the things that normal kids did. We played board games. We watched TV together, and we studied together, because education was very important in our household, and so it was a pretty happy household in the beginning. But then one day my father, he worked the minimum wage job, but because he had to feed a family of 8, he had 2 minimum wage jobs. So he was on his way home from one of his jobs, and he was in a car accident. And the car accident was so bad that his car was wrapped around a tree in a U shape, and he left the accident with 2 scars. There was one scar down the middle of his face, and then there was another scar. That scar was really visible, but then there was another scar that wasn't visible, and that was a scar on his heart. And from that day on, our household changed. It wasn't a happy household anymore. It became a war zone, and my father became an abuser. And so the first person that he saw at night, that's who he beat. Sometimes it was me. Sometimes it was one of my brothers and sisters, but most of the time it was my mother. And so that went on for a long time, and so it wasn't a happy household then. And so then, so it went on for a while. But my grandfather, he lived under us. He was one of the 3 families, and so he would hear the beatings every day. And so one day he got tired of hearing the beatings, so he confronted my father in the front yard, and they got into a big argument. And then my grandfather, he shot my father in front of me and my brothers and sisters, and so it wasn't a happy household then. But even though it wasn't a happy household, we were good students. In fact, I was actually a straight A student. I was a good enough student that I went to a school in my community that was one of the top 10 schools in the entire country. And so when I went to that school, in the beginning I excelled. Academically, I was a straight A student. Socially, I was on the student council. And athletically, I was on the football team. And things were going okay for me. I was happy then, but after I'd been there for a couple of years, I found out that I suffered from an incurable disease. And so there wasn't a lot of understanding about my disease at that time. So I was asked to leave. And so I left that school, and I went to another school that it was a college prep school. And so that school, again, I excelled academically. I was a straight A student. Socially, I was on the drama club and the student council. Athletically, I was on the football team and the basketball team, and things were going good for me there. But once again, they found out about my disease, and they asked me to leave. And so I left that school, and I went to another school. It was a community school. It wasn't a special school at all. It was just a regular neighborhood school. And one thing I found out about at that school is that there was a little bit more understanding, because there were other people at that school with my disease. So when I went to that school, I really excelled. Socially, I was the prom king. I was the homecoming king. I was Mr. Senior. Um, Academically, I graduated in the top 10%. Athletically, I was the captain of the football team, and I played basketball. And when I left that school, my classmates voted me most likely to succeed. And so when I left the school, I scored really well on the SATs. So I had my choice of schools to go to. I decided to go to the University of Cincinnati, where I wanted to be a lawyer and a football player. But shortly after I got there, I found out that even though it was a school of higher learning, they didn't understand my disease either. So first I was asked to leave the football team, and then I was asked to leave the University of Cincinnati. And then I was kind of lost. I didn't know what to do. I kind of hung out at my mother's house. But one day while I was hanging out at my mother's house, I saw a commercial that said I could see the world and be all I could be. And so I decided to join the Navy and serve my country. And so I did. And then I went to the Navy. I joined it. I went to a ship that was on a world tour, and they went to Africa, and they went to Asia, and they went to the Middle East, and they went to the Far East. They went to the Philippines and Thailand and Australia. But I wasn't able to see any of those places because shortly after I got to the ship, they labeled me a liberty risk because of my disease. And so I could only leave the boat during daytime hours. And so I always had duty during daytime hours. And finally, when we got back to the United States, once again, I was asked to leave. So I went back to Cincinnati and I started living what most people consider the American dream. I bought a home in the suburbs. I got married. I went through a series of pretty decent jobs. I was a restaurant manager. I was a car salesman. I was an environmental activist. But one by one, because of my disease, I lost those things. I lost the jobs. I lost the possessions. I lost my house. And I lost my wife, and I became homeless. But when I first became homeless, I wasn't homeless in the traditional sense. I didn't live in a shelter or under a bridge or in an abandoned building or in an abandoned car. I lived doubled up with a friend or on someone's couch, and but the same thing would happen. Someone would give me a chance to stay at their place or in their basement on their couch, and they'd find out about my disease and they'd ask me to leave. And finally, I ran out of places to go, and I did become homeless in a traditional sense. And so the thing I remember most about when I first got out there was that I was always lonely and I was always hungry. I was lonely because I would pass hundreds of people on the street every day, and no one ever took the time to say my name. And so if you don't hear your name for a long time, it's a very lonely feeling. And no one ever took the time to make eye contact. They looked past me. They looked around me. Sometimes it felt like they were looking through me. I felt invisible. I felt like I was no longer part of the human race. And I was always hungry because I didn't know about soup kitchens or shelters or places to get free food. So I did whatever I had to do to survive. Sometimes I panhandled. Sometimes I shoplifted. Sometimes I even had to dumpster dive. I did whatever I had to do to survive. And that went on for a long time, but then it started to get cold, and it was really cold one day, and it was also wet, and that's the worst time for homeless people, when you're cold and you're wet because you can't get dry. So I remember seeing on TV that people sometimes hung out at the bus station, so I went to the bus station, and I ran into some homeless guys, and they told me some really good information. Homeless people are pretty caring people, so they told me where I could find a place to sleep and a roof over my head and something to eat. So I went to a place called the Drop-In Center in Cincinnati. The Drop-In Center was a room like this with 170 mats about 6 inches away from each other. And you're in a shelter, you want to look kind of tough, and so I always slept in the back because I didn't look so tough. Because most nights I cried myself to sleep because after all I was most likely to succeed. And I had succeeded in ending up in a homeless shelter. And then I get up in the morning and I go to work. I went to work every day. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning, went to a temporary service. I waited till 7. They gave me a job which I had to travel an hour and a half to get to. I worked for 9 hours because they didn't pay me for lunch. We traveled an hour and a half back, and then I waited an hour to get my check. And at the end of the day, I usually had about $20. I worked every day, but I never made enough money to find a place to live. And the worst thing about it wasn't that the pay was so low and I place to live. The worst thing was that they never took the time to know my name. Even if you're homeless, they take out taxes. They make you pay for safety equipment. They make you pay for travel, all kinds of things. So that went on for a long time. Then one day, I was at the shelter, and this guy walked up to me with these funny horn rim glasses on, and he started talking. And the first thing I realized is that he was looking me in the eye. And he asked me my name in the beginning, and he said my name about 3 times during the conversation. And that really had an effect on me. And at the end of the conversation, I didn't remember everything he said, but I remembered these 4 words. He said, "I'm glad you're here." And so that really touched me. And so he also told me that although my disease is progressive, it's incurable, and it's fatal if not arrested, there is treatment for my disease. So he told me that there was treatment right there. My disease is the disease of addiction. And there was treatment right there at that place called the Drop-In Center. It was a 6-month treatment program. One of the components of the program was community service. And I started doing my community service with a place called the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless. I need to pause for a second, though. Sorry, I'm more. You guys want, I'm going to take my coat off. You guys want. So I started doing my community service with the Greater Cincinnati Coalition, and so I worked as a volunteer for the coalition for about 6 months, and then after 6 months they hired me as an outreach worker, and as an outreach worker I created a street newspaper called Street Vibes. I created a television show about homeless people called Street Vibes. I created a radio show about homeless people called Street Vibes. And I created a band for homeless people. You probably can't guess the band. They weren't very creative with names. So I did that. I'm sorry, I'm still warm. I have on layers though, okay. So I start working after 6 months, I worked as the volunteer. They hired me again as the outreach worker, and I did that for 2 years. And then after 2 years as the outreach worker, they hired me as the first formerly homeless African-American director of the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless. And so I looked around as the director at these programs in Cincinnati for homeless people. One thing I realized is that there were all these programs for homeless people, but there were no homeless people involved in the planning process. So I created something called the Homeless Think Tank. And it became a model for the city of Cincinnati, and they adopted the Homeless Think Tank. So if you had a program that you wanted to start for homeless people in Cincinnati, you had to use the Homeless Think Tank. And that model actually started my advocacy role, and so that advocacy got recognized on a state level, and I became a board member for the State Coalition on Housing and Homelessness in Ohio. And after doing that for a while, I got a little recognition for advocacy on a national level, and I became a board member for the National Coalition for the Homeless. After 2 years on that board, I became the first formerly homeless board president for the National Coalition for the Homeless. And then 2 years later, I was hired as the first formerly homeless executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. So let me tell you about some really wonderful things that happened to me as the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. I had the opportunity to have dinner at the home of President Bill and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. I was able to testify before the United States Congress in both written and verbal testimony on several occasions. I was able to help write legislation that, if enacted, would have ended homelessness in this country. We were able as a coalition to pass legislation to make sure that every school district in this country has a liaison for homeless children. I'm really proud of that opportunity. I was able to help plan the anniversary of the 40-year March on Washington, where I got to hang out with some of the great civil rights leaders of our time, Martin Luther King III, Jesse Jackson, John Lewis, and I could go on and on. I got to speak at the anniversary of the 40-year March on Washington. I got to sit on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial with Coretta Scott King in one of her last public appearances before she died. I was able to do some things creatively that I've always wanted to do. As you see, you probably can tell that I like to act. So I have been able to act. I've been able to produce. I've produced music. I've been able to write 3 plays. I've been able to do technical difficulties. I finished my first novel. It's called Most Unlikely to Succeed. Shameless self-promotion, Amazon.com. I've also been able to act in 3 movies, 3 independent movies, and in 2000 for an independent movie called Open the Sky, I received an Emmy Award. Wow. Again, I tell my story that way because I want people to understand in this room that homelessness is not a permanent condition. It's a situation. It is not a moral situation. It's an economic situation. And people who are homeless do not remain homeless. Some of us go on to do some really good things. And if you don't remember anything I said tonight, remember this quote by the great Booker T. Washington. He said, "Success should not be judged by one's station in life, but the obstacles they've had to overcome to get there." And please, if you're homeless in this room, please remember that this situation is not your destiny, and you can go on to do whatever you want to do in this world. God has been really special to me and allowed me to do some wonderful things in my life, and I'm just truly grateful for all those individuals who are willing to give of themselves and do the things in community service that helped me become the person that I've become today. And I'm not a good person because I have an Emmy or wrote a book or wrote a play. I'm a good person because I'm able every day of my life to freely give back what was given to me. And I think if we can do that in our lives, if we can make that our purpose, we're truly doing what we were brought here to do. And a couple of other things. I know a lot of you do community service. You've talked about the community service you've done here through the Washington Center. Many times you do that community service and you don't get to see the tangible results of community service. Well, tonight you have a room full of the tangible results of community service. So I thank you very much for allowing me to speak. And if no one's told you today, I'm glad you're here. Thank you very much.